Hello, friends. Welcome to Literary Concepts. Today's topic is the post colonial period. Post colonial means after the end of colonial rule. So, post means after, colonial means controlling one country over the another country politically. Understand? Now, let us try to understand the post colonial period in English literature. The post colonial period in English literature particularly refers to the body of works produced aftermath of the colonial rule. So, after the end of the colonial rule, okay, so a body of works were created, written, and particularly from the mid 20th century onwards. So, after the end of the colonial period, so different literary works were written. So from the mid of the 20th century onwards, so that period, okay, that time during that period is nothing but post-colonial period. So the term post-colonial refers to post-colonial literally means period after decolonization. So, decolonization means free from colonization. So, the period after the colonial period is nothing but post colonial period. But in literary studies, whereas in literary studies, it continued to include the critique of colonial ideology, the legacy of imperialism, the struggles for identity, autonomy, and voice in formerly colonized societies. So, whereas in literary studies, we find that criticism of colonial ideology and the long lasting effects of the emperor's rule. Imperialism means rule by an emperor, rule by an emperor's rule, and the struggles for identity and autonomy, that is liberation and freedom and voice in the formerly colonized societies. The countries which were colonized, in these countries we find okay these aspects, so criticizing that colonial ideologies and colonial ideas. Understand? And the effects of the long lasting impact of the imperialism and struggle for identity and liberation and freedom. So these aspects we find in post colonial period. So post colonial literature deeply concerned, they are very much worried with questions of power, history, culture, language, and representation. So, post colonial writers, they deeply concerned with these questions, that is, power, history, culture, language, and representation. So, the collapse of European empires following World War II, the downfall of European rule, and World War II, the rise of nationalist movements in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. So, we find that nationalism movements in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean islands, and the effects of colonial oppression, all these events gave rise to a diverse range of literary expressions. So all these made had a long lasting impact to write on different topics and themes in okay uh, English literature. Understand? In literature, different works were created because of all these events. So, post colonial literature is not confined to single style. So, post colonial literature is not restricted to one particular style or one particular geographical location. So, it is inherently, understand, so it is uh, naturally pluralistic and interdisciplinary. So we find the diversified, the different ideas, the diversified culture, multiculturalism, and interdisciplinary aspects, that is drawing from oral traditions, okay, folklore, local languages, and hybrid identities. Understand? So the combination of identities, so oral traditions, customs, folklores, okay, folk tales, and local languages, everything, okay, mixed of all these identities and cultures we find in post-colonial literature. Now, let us try to understand the characteristics of post colonial literature. The first characteristic is critique of colonialism and imperialism. Okay, criticizing colonialism. Colonialism means so it is taking control of the another country. Understand? And imperialism means rule by an emperor, ruled by a king. So post colonial literature exposes, so they brings out the brutality and racism and exploitation and cultural erasure associated with colonial rule. So during the colonial period, we find that the cruelty and racism and exploitation and cultural eradication, okay, so aspects and the events, so which happened during colonial rule, colonial colonialism, so those aspects, so post colonial literature exposed, they brings out, they focused on these aspects, and it also seeks to deconstruct colonial ideologies, so that is to reinterpret, to reanalyze the colonial ideologies and reveal their ongoing influence, okay, and bring out their influence on modern institutions and societies, modern institutions and modern societies. The next characteristic is cultural hybridity and identity. So cultural hybridity means, so that is cultural mixing, the merging of diverse cultural elements, practices, and traditions. So we find authors of post colonial literature explore that hybrid identities formed at the intersection of native and colonial cultures. So, because of this mixed uh, nature, understand the mixed nature, the interchanging nature of native and colonial cultures. So we find hybrid identities in post colonial literature. The post colonial texts, the works, portray conflicted selves negotiating between inherited traditions and imposed norms. We find that the conflicted selves, okay, the clash between, the fight between, okay, inherited the native traditions, the local traditions, and imposed one, the forcefully imposed rules and norms and traditions on colonized people. Understand? Colonized societies. The next characteristic is language and linguistic resistance. So, resistance means opposition. Okay, it is refusal. So, language has become a site of contestation where that we find different disputes and arguments during post-colonial times. So language has become more uh, site of contestation, disputes. So many post-colonial writers, they write in the colonizers' language. So many post-colonial writers, they write in the colonizers, means the countries, the country which occupied the another country, okay, so the colonizer means who, okay, who dominated in dominance language, for example, that is English. Okay, English is the colonizer's language. So post colonial writers wrote in English to reshape it. Understand? For what? So to reflect the indigenous rhythms, idioms, and experiences. So, to reflect, to focus more on the indigenous, the local, the native rhythms, the native idioms, and the local, uh, the original people's experiences, they want to write it in English, understand, thereby subverting its authority. So, thereby weakening that colonial ideology. Understand, the weakening means undermining the power and authority of the colonizer's language. So colonizers ideology and language. So the next characteristic is rewriting history and canonical texts. So that is rewriting history and canonical text means authority to standard official texts. So post-colonial works often revisit and rewrite historical events from the perspective of the colonized. Understand? So post-colonial works, they often what they did, they revisited, okay, and they rewritten the historical events from the point of view of the colonized, the oppressed. Understand? They also respond to or reimagine canonical Western texts. So they also had their own response and reimagination of that the standard Western texts. They respond to the standard Western texts. The next characteristic is displacement and diaspora. So, displacement, so that is removal from a homeland. So, moving from a homeland, changing of the position, and diaspora, so that is migration of people from homeland. So, the themes of migration, exile, so that is expelling, throwing out, or rootlessness, and cultural alienation, separation are central to post colonial literature. So, the themes like the topics like migration, exile, and rootlessness, and cultural alienation, that is, cultural separation, are main themes, okay, the central themes of the post colonial literature. Writers explore the psychological and cultural impact of displacement. Understand, the writers, they explored more about that psychological effect and cultural effect of displacement, that is migration. Understand, from one place to another place. The next characteristic is nationalism and decolonization. So the celebration of indigenous cultures, that is original cultures. Indigenous means original, native, local cultures. National consciousness, that is nationalism, evolved, started, and the desire to forge new post-colonial identities. So they wanted to create new post-colonial identities are the key themes in post-colonial literature. So literature becomes a form of cultural resistance and self-assertion. Understand? We find that literature has become a form, okay, a weapon for cultural resistance, cultural opposition, and self-assertion. That is asserting oneself, asserting one's own opinions. That is uh, focusing more on the one's culture, one's opinion, one's rights. Understand? So these are the different characteristics which we find in post-colonial literature. So now let us learn more about the major writers and their important works of post-colonial period. The first writer is Chinua Achebe, whose time period started in 1930 and ended in 2013. So Chinu Achbe's important works are Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. Okay, the next work is No Longer at Ease, which was published in 1960. So the themes like colonial violence, African tradition, identity we find in the works of Chinu Achebe. The next writer is Gugi Thiong'o, so who was born in 1938 and he was passed recently, so in 2025. So Gugi Thiong'o's important works, A Grain of Wheat, which was published in 1967, and the next one is Decolonizing the Mind, which was published in 1986. The themes like nationalism, language politics, anti imperialism, so we find in Gugi Thiong'o's works. The next writer is Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie, who was born in 1947. So his important works are Midnight's Children, which was published in 1981, The Satanic Verses, which was published in 1988. So the themes like history, hybridity, post-colonial India. So these themes we find in Salman Rushdie's works. The next writer is Jean Rice. Jean Rice, so whose time period started in 1890 and ended in 1979. So his important work is White Sargasso Sea, which was published in 1966. So the themes like feminism, racial identity, rewriting colonial narratives we find in the works of Jean Rice. The next writer is Derek Walcott, whose time period started in 1930 and ended in 2017. So his important works, the first one is Omeros, Omeros, which was published in 1990. Another one is Another Life, so which was published in 1973. A Caribbean Identity, Classical Forms, Colonial Heritage. These were the themes of Derek Walcott. Derek Walcott. The next writer is Arundhati Roy, so who was born in 1961. Her important work is The God of Small Things, which was published in 1997. Caste, memory, family trauma, post colonial Kerala. These are the themes which we find in the Arundhati Roy's works. The next writer is V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul, who was born in 1932 and died in 2018. V.S. Naipaul's important works, A House for Mr. Biswas, which was published in 1961. The next one is The Mimic Men, which was published in 1967. The themes like diaspora, displacement, colonial alienation. So these themes we find in V.S. Naipaul's works. The next writer is Amitav Ghosh, who was born in 1956. His important works, The Shadow Lines, which was published in 1988. The next one is Sea of Poppies, which was published in 2008. The themes like transnational histories, memory, and migration. So these aspects we find in Amitav Ghosh works. I hope you understand the fundamentals and concept of post-colonial period. So if you like the content, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much.